I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Most vapers know it to be true because they saw it. Public health propaganda intended to combat the so-called epidemic of teen vaping actually fueled youth interest instead. There's a clear and obvious connection, and now we have the proof. In a bombshell new report by Michelle Minton, senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, entitled Perverse Psychology: How Anti-Vaping Campaigners Created the Youth Vaping Epidemic, Minton argues that it was not the vaping industry that reignited youth interest in vaping. It was anti-vaping advocacy, which is not surprising for a lot of us who know what's been going on with all of the propaganda. And joining us today from an underground bunker somewhere near Washington, D.C. is Michelle Minton. Michelle, thanks for coming back on RegWatch.
Thanks for inviting me back on.
Oh, man, it's great. Every time you're on, we had you on immediately after President Trump made his September 11th announcement. Every time I say 9/11, obviously, I think it's something else.
Yeah.
How he possibly could have done that on the same day. It's just unbelievable. But you were great.
Deaf, whoever would have thought.
Oh, yeah.
Tone deaf.
True. And now, your appearance on RegWatch last year at this time delivered a piece we called Collusion, because you steal all the best pairings of two words. The report was Fear Profiteers: How E-Cigarette Panic Benefits Health Activists. And wow, that was like one of the best pieces and most well reacted to out of anyone we've ever done.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I'm glad your fans liked it. Like I said, when we talked about it on the video, crickets from most of the rest of the world.
And that's amazing. So now this is a follow-up piece in terms of, year number 2, and we're going to get another big report from Michelle. So why don't you walk us through what's the Competitive Enterprise Institute? A lot of people don't know what that is. I want to make sure you always, get that right off the bat so people can understand the viewpoint that you're coming from. And then let's dive into the report. Give us the top line.
Yeah, so CEI, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, is a nonprofit think tank in DC. And if you don't know what a think tank is, it just means it's a bunch of scholars who get paid to think about stuff. And our particular think tank focuses on regulation. We are libertarian, if you want to put a title on it. We consider ourselves nonpartisan. We take the policy positions that we think would be best for consumers, the economy, for liberty generally. And my wheelhouse there is we call what I do the consumer policy fellow, senior
Right.
fellow, but it's really the vice. It's the vice wheelhouse. I do alcohol, gambling, cannabis, tobacco, and food. All of the things that are liable to have a sin tax put on them. That's
Right.
pretty much my wheelhouse. And I've been working there for about 13 years now. And CI, as someone who is not, I am fully nonpartisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. They've really given me a home to talk about the science behind a lot of these policies from my perspective and make my own determinations based on the evidence.
Well, okay, well, that's very good. I'm just working on getting your PDF with all the new... Oh, and I've lost you on our 2-shot. Isn't that now fun? Hold on one second.
Then I'm going to have a drink of beer while you do that.
You can have a drink of beer for sure. It will be very easy to get.
I'm over 21, I promise. You didn't know. You couldn't guess.
What do you think of the... Stop it. What do you think of the 21 legislation?
It's one of those feel-good pieces of legislation that we're seeing spread like wildfire all across the country that no one's really thought about very deeply. It just seems like a good idea, kind of like 18 being the age of majority seems like a good idea, and the alcohol age limit at 21 seems like a good idea, but very few people bother to investigate what it would actually do. And the few studies that have been done, I think there have been 2 or 3 at this point, where they look at what happens when you make the tobacco purchasing age 21 and you combine both combustible and non-combustible tobacco products for whatever reason. There's no really good explanation for why this occurs. I can think of a few, but combustible tobacco use among people under the age of 21 goes up wherever the age limit is 21. And it's most likely because it's just easier to get cigarettes than it is to get everything else. There are just more of those around than there are of snus, for example, or e-cigarettes. So kids who want to use something, who feel the desire to use tobacco, when it becomes just a little bit harder for them to get vapor products, they go to the old standby cigarettes. So and it's a small percentage increase, honestly. It's not a very big increase. But if you're talking about the entire country, it's fairly, 1% of kids suddenly choosing to smoke cigarettes is pretty substantial when a good portion of those will also go on to be lifelong smokers. And that's just not something that's being talked about. It's something I've been advocating for, not saying don't do this. I mean, don't do this, but if you're going to do this, at least put in some kind of measure for a study of it afterwards to see what's happening, to see the effects of the law, and to see if whether or not you should continue it. Don't make it just like alcohol, the alcohol age limit, just put it in and then disregard the fact that 70% of people, Americans, drink alcohol before they're 21, and what that means for their lives and their health and their safety.
Now, isn't that always the case, actually? You bring in major regulation like that, major changes, and you put no provisions in it at all to study it. That's basically because you don't want to know, or you believe strongly that the results are going to be exactly what you intended them to be. Government has
pay someone to make your results exactly what you expect them to be. That's
true. Well, that's true. That's true. Studies can be generated, as we know, to pretty much say whatever we want. So let's talk about perverse psychology. And again, I love your pairing. You really kick butt there. So, one is so perverse about the propaganda coming from anti-vaping groups in your mind, and how is it, perpetuating or at least contributing? You put the qualifier on it for us. How is it interacting with the epidemic of teen vaping?
Yeah, I'm not going to pull any punches here. I think the uptick in youth vaping we saw after 2017, that was captured by the 2018 survey data, was entirely caused by anti-vaping campaigners, by the media who took up the cause and putting out hundreds, thousands, millions maybe of news stories about the horrors of the youth vaping epidemic. I think that entirely explains the sudden uptick we saw after a pretty significant decrease that was occurring after 2015. Between 2015 and 2016, high school, the number of high school students who said they vaped at all in the last 30 months dropped 30%. And the next year, it was the same pretty much. So that's huge. And then something suddenly shifted and it just started to skyrocket again. And as I was looking through what changed, Juul had been around since 2015. Granted, it wasn't super popular when it first came out. It started to build in popularity. But at the same time, the whole industry, because of the scrutiny they were getting from Campaign for Tobacco for Kids, etc., they started to really tighten up on their advertising, their social media presence, even their flavors. And at the same time, that's when we saw this enormous spike in youth use. And the only thing I could see that really changed was the fact that we had a sudden increase in anti-vaping advertising. And when I started looking into it, I got to see the real numbers of how much money was being spent, how many advertisements were out there, how many news stories started to pop up, and how different the news conversation was about vaping at that time leading up to the so-called epidemic. And then I started looking into child psychology and research into other public health campaigns to try and convince the population to do something for their own good. And what I found was, the title of the paper, Perverse Psychology, is a play on reverse psychology. When you're saying, oh, don't give me that thing. That would be really terrible. And what you want them to do is give you a thing. And this is a playbook, the tobacco playbook, big tobacco playbook. When they said to kids, they were forced to put out anti-tobacco ads, and they said, this is an adult product, don't smoke. And they knew very well that what that would do to adolescents is say, oh, I want to feel like an adult. I want to do things that are forbidden, so therefore I'm going to try and smoke. And that's unintentionally, most likely, what is happening with anti-vaping advocacy, is that they've put out so many news stories talking about this epidemic of youth vaping and how horrible it is and how it's only for adults, that kids have become interested in it again after a huge decline.
Yeah, and isn't that what we've learned from the 2019 National Youth Tobacco Survey? They released that or early December, I guess, maybe. They snuck that out there in a paper saying, oh, by the way, it happens to be curiosity. I've actually got, I'm just going to put this over to you to make sure that I don't kill everything here. And I've actually got the results from that survey. So let me just grab that right here. Okay, so where are we at here? Okay, right here. And right here, so let's go from that here. So this was the 2019, so this is the Centers for Disease Control, and these are the 3 most common reasons for use. Oops, and that obviously was not it. One sec, there we go. And so number 1 was being curious about them. And Yeah. Okay. So kids are curious, and that is 55.3% of respondents, and a lot of respondents. This is their big survey, right? So they've got a big enough sample group of high school kids around the country that can be fairly accurate in terms of, capturing what's going on. And hello, in 2019, I was curious about them.
Number one by far reason. And you know what's interesting to me about that number is it is almost identical. This is very weird, even among populations as similar as the United States and the UK, for example. You don't normally see a lot of that much parity between numbers, but the youth vaping surveys that have been done in the UK, what they found among the adolescents who said they vaped, the number one reason at 53% of youth in the UK said they were curious. That's why they tried e-cigarettes. So it's 53% to 50, almost 56%, 55%. That's almost exactly the same number. Yet in the UK, they have far less youth reporting actually vaping. But curiosity is still the number one reason. So and that's one of the things I wanted to look, that report coming out, the data coming out and showing curiosity being a factor. I was already writing this paper. I'd been writing it for 9 months or so. It just confirmed exactly. It was another confirmation of what I was talking about. And I wanted to see, what could have possibly raised youth curiosity about these products. And that's what this study gets into.
And that's excellent. And just so our viewers know, how many people outside of your office or anywhere has seen this report?
As I told you before, you are one of 2 people outside of CEI who has seen the paper.
So that means our audience
Totally
are
exclusive.
totally exclusive. So this little chit chat, except for when you're at a bar, but that doesn't
Well,
count.
I've been talking about the fact that I'm pretty, I've been asserting that it was the anti-vaping campaigns that have caused the uptick in youth vaping for at least 9 months or more when I started to investigate this and when I realized it could be something worth writing a paper about. So as soon as I just did I had FOIA results come back and I immediately started publishing everything I found on Twitter, even though, if I was a good journalist, reporter or whatever, I'd wait and then I'd do a piece revealing bombshell, revealing all this stuff, but I want it out there immediately. So when I started to find evidence that it was the anti-vaping advocacy that was causing the youth interest in vaping, I wanted to put that out there as fast as possible to get people looking into it. I like democratize investigation is what I'm into. So the more people looking into a thing, the more likely we are to find something.
And, and I like that a lot. And just to clarify my choice of the word bombshell in the lead, and that's because it's not a bombshell for those in the vaping world. I think that's pretty clear. Everybody saw it. They knew that most kids that were seeing Juul ads weren't seeing Juul ads. They were seeing, media stories on Juul that made Juul look cool. Yeah. They were seeing, posters in the bathroom at the high school telling them not to Juul, yet still somehow making Juul look cool. And, clearly there was an uptick from that. But bombshell, though, because if you're a parent and you really, only just watch MSN, if you were to somehow come across this report or this story that we're filing here today, it would be a bombshell. You'd be like, yeah. Well, I was told it was all about flavors and stuff. No, it's curiosity, but it's not just curiosity. So let's just go back to the 3. So again, curious about them is 55.3%, but get this, 30.8 is friends and family use them. So now we're talking about nearly, we're looking at 85, 86% of all the use comes down to curiosity or some form of normalization that comes from seeing your friends or family use it.
Well, now keep in mind, they could choose multiple options.
Right.
So the kids, which makes the low number who said flavors extremely interesting, because that means everyone chose other things, potentially multiple other choices besides flavors. They could have said, well, I was curious and also the flavors, but they didn't. Most of them said these other, they said family and friends using or curiosity, even though they had the choice to tick all the boxes if they wanted to.
Right. The flavors came in. So they are available in flavors such as mint, candy, fruit, or chocolate. And that came in at 22.4%. That's like paltry.
Almost as much as tricks, that I can do tricks with them.
So, what do we make of this? Because the CDC, they're horrible. This is crazy. Because if you actually, so I'll take you over to the computer here in a sec, and let me just kind of preface this. If you go to FDA's posting from December that was on the 2019 data. Let me just get there. So take us over to here. Here we go. And so if you take a look, there we go. All right, so FDA. There it is right here. So this is FDA's posting. Okay, so excuse me, this was November 6th when they posted the results from the youth tobacco survey. And obviously at any point they could update this after the CDC's paper comes out. But instead, when they did update it, because I believe this was a later graphic, they were crazy with their graphics this year. Because in Michelle, as you know, there was at that point, after this original release, this data release happened, they came back out and released, and they added another million more, right, to the teen use. Mm-hmm. So I'll just come back to you in a sec. But here we have, their 2019 data. This is the official, FDA and CDC's work here. But what's amazing is they highlight understanding why students use e-cigarettes. And the data is from 2016. It's like on purpose. So this is 2019.
Jeez.
Right? And so
if you eliminated it, they don't even mention it. Curiosity.
No. And why not 2017? Why not 2018? And 2019 was out weeks later. And so they go with 2016. And the reason why they go with 2016, of course, is because flavors are up higher in the response, but still only second. It's still the number one reason why is friends and family. So they really they've really just been lying.
Yeah, and they're it looks like, and this isn't an allegation, this is just a supposition, but it looks like they're altering the survey to get the right narrative that they want. This is something Dr. Michael Siegel pointed out, that starting in 2016, they asked about what if students were vaping marijuana, for example. They didn't say, what are you vaping? But they said, are you vaping nicotine, just flavors, marijuana, etc.? And they did it in 2016, 2017, and 2018. The numbers were extremely high. So the CDC knew in 2016 that youth vaping of THC was pretty high. And then for some reason in 2019, they just didn't ask. And presumably they're not going to ask in 2020. And that seems, right now, that seems like some really important information, some important data that we'd love to have in the midst of an outbreak related to tainted black market THC vape cartridges. But for some reason, CDC just chose not to ask that question.
And Dr. Naira mentioned that too as well in our piece a couple of weeks ago. To not ask that question is malfeasance.
I would love an explanation. I know a lot of people would like quite a few bits of explanation from the CDC. They're just not really answering. I recently reached out to the CDC to ask them who came up with and why did they come up with the title E-Valley for the outbreak, e-cigarette or vaping associated pulmonary injury. And because I noticed when that happened, it was in October, well after the evidence was very clear that, and the CDC admitted that THC vaping was part of a big part of the problem, a growing focus of the investigation. And prior to that, it had just been called vaping-associated respiratory injury or something like that. Why did they choose E-Valley, which emphasizes the use of e-cigarettes? And I got a pretty canned response of just, we used all the facts and blah, blah, the science says we should do X, Y, and Z. It was a nothing response, but I would really like to know what went in to the decision to emphasize e-cigarettes, the decision to not ask about cannabis on the youth tobacco survey. But we will almost never get answers from CDC because you have to do a FOIA request and then they wait for a year or more to actually give you anything if they choose to give you anything. So
it's a make you grow moss strategy. So you basically fungus and stuff.
They try and raise the hurdles to just wean everybody away until somebody comes in with a bunch of lawyers and they're forced to give things. And this happened. I know we talked about this before off air, that I had a recent FOIA request come back from the state of Michigan, from the health department there, and they did exactly the same stuff. All of these hurdles they raised just to see if they can make me go away without having to do anything, and then ultimately just deciding to give me because a lawyer called them and they don't want to deal with that. So they'll wait for another couple of months until I email them again and say, where are the results? And then they'll give them over to me, what they choose to give me.
Well, and that is true. And it is the government, though, so we should be expecting such stall tactics. They came up with E-Valley because they could no longer reference it by calling it vaping related lung disease because it just clearly wasn't doing it for them. And so, yeah, so you need to have an acronym set up in a term like that to diseaseify it, if that's the best way to put it. And let me share this as an example that week that they came out with E-Valley, I ended up out at my parents' place out at the farm for a visit. And my mom says, so what's going on with that E-Valley? So it's designed for people who don't have or low information on the issue. My mom's not lower information on it, but still though, she's like, so what's going on with E-Valley?
It's even hard for us in the research community. We've talked about this repeatedly, how even though we don't like the word E-Valley, it's hard not to use it because it's parlance. It's easy. It's instead of saying the outbreak that started this summer, it's something short. We would all prefer it be something else, but
no, that's why they did it. That's why they did it.
I know.
Oh, don't use it. I mean, I've had to admonish a few people for using it because.
Yeah. Oh, I don't use it in my writing. I'm very careful not to do it unless I'm talking about the actual terminology or the use of the word. But I always say the outbreak. But if you're just talking amongst yourselves, and then someone invariably says, "Don't use that," like don't just buy into it.
Yeah, no. I mean, by using it, you're totally buying into it. And what it does is it actually covers up what happened, right? Because it medicalizes it, diseaseifies it is my favorite little term. It's my truthy term of the week.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah. Okay, so let's get right back to this because I want a plethora of sound bites that come out of this piece with you skewering public health over, fueling the epidemic. So let's talk about that. How did they fuel it? What are some of the concrete examples?
I mean, in child developmental psychology, it's well known that you can tell an authority figure can tell young children not to do a thing, and they will believe it, and they'll say, "Okay." If you tell it to adolescents, usually reject messages from authority. They also tend to anything they think is trying to convince them to do something or trying to take away their choices, their options. They're very liable to reject it. We call it, or we in psychology they call it reactance. Everyone has the possibility of having a reactant response. If you think of when you're watching an advertisement and someone's selling you something that's really over the top, and you're like, yeah, you're just trying to sell me this thing. That's what happens with kids when they watch public health announcements or read public health posters, and they say, don't smoke, kids, it's bad for your health. They go, yeah, you're gonna tell me that. You're the man. You're supposed to tell me that. And the stronger it is, the more they say you don't have a choice. You have to do this thing. There's a boomerang effect where they say, well, I'm an adult, because that's the time of life. Adolescence is the time of life where you're trying to claim your independence. You're trying to be more autonomous. And when someone tells you you're not, you're much more liable to have a big reaction to it in order to reclaim your own autonomy. And so that's what we've seen with programs like DARE in the US, which was the program to try and keep kids off drugs. And when they went back into a little bit of research on how it was working, what they found was the kids who were exposed to DARE were actually more inclined to try drugs, specifically marijuana. The same was true with my anti-drug, which was, my family's my anti-drug. There's advertisements showing like how you can be a healthy teen and not be on drugs and not do marijuana. It's bad for you. And what it was doing, what those ads were doing, were normalizing the idea of adolescents using drugs. And that's something the anti-tobacco people have talked about a lot, about vaping renormalizing smoking among adolescents. But that's exactly what they've been doing by saying there's an epidemic of youth vaping. All your friends are vaping, but you shouldn't vape. And what they're doing is saying to these kids, everyone's doing it. When a kid hears that, they think, well, if everyone's doing it, maybe I should at least give it a try. And then they see, well, if you do it, you're bad. It's only for adults. You shouldn't do it. We're going to take door stalls off bathrooms in high schools and punish you, expel you. And then all of the teenagers who are in the midst of teen rebellion, a very common thing. Most of us went through this feeling of trying to take your own independence. It becomes the easiest way to do it. The easiest way, if you feel like your freedom is threatened by something, even something small, something as small as a public health advertisement saying, well, you should do this. If that piques in your mind a feeling of threat to your ability to choose things, to choose what you want to do, the easiest way to reclaim that choice is to just do exactly what you're told not to. And kids are more, adolescents are more prone to this feeling, which is why it's a trope that teenagers always do what they're told not to do. And again, that gets back to reverse psychology, where there have been a lot of cartoons, and in my paper I have a few comic strips where they're talking about this, where if you have a teenager and you want them to do something, tell them to do exactly the opposite and they'll do it. Like they'll do what you want them to do if you tell them not to.
Right. Now, I would show the paper normally, but it's not published yet, and I've got a it's not a finalized version. It's just to let everybody know the paper does exist.
Yeah. And I'll definitely come back on when it's out to talk more in depth about it if you want.
I will have you on all the time because you are a firebrand, and we don't hear enough from you. Let me put it to you that way. So, okay, so let's look at this for a little bit. I prepared a couple of slides that kind of top line. Where is it? Here we go. Okay, so let's use this here to kind of take us into a bit of a deeper part on this. So this is self-fulfilling epidemic. So these are the things that you I love it. It's like you're recommending going, well, just in case there happens to be one of these heartless anti-vaping people out there that, are in charge of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they happen to be reading my paper. I'm going to give them some advice on what to avoid doing in order to not backfire their program. And the first one is raising awareness about products or behaviors that did not exist before. What does that mean?
Right. So this is the idea that, youth use of products, for example, youth use of marijuana. So a lot of kids would never think to try marijuana, unless they were seeing it, right? Unless they were seeing other people their age do it, right? When you look at your grandparents taking their heart medication, you don't think, oh, that's something I want to do. That's an adult thing to do, until you start seeing other people around your age, maybe the types of people you want to be, people in their 20s doing it. And then the suggestion that it is okay. Well, for example, I would give this example. The California Department of Public Health put out an advertisement where real teens talk about their vaping experiences. And the statements made in that commercial, I think it was maybe a 2-minute long commercial from teenagers, are, I get away with it. My parents never know about it. I post things on YouTube and Snapchat and Twitter. My parents don't know. It's great. All my friends do it. My friends think it's cool. Some of my friends are sponsored by vape companies. They are functionally selling why and how to vape if you are a teenager in high school.
Absolutely. And I have that queued up. So okay. Let's see here if we can make this happen. It's over on the other computer here. I had it ready for us, so I do have it ready. And let's just make sure. I'm going to kill your mic.
I play baseball, basketball, and play football. Those are the 3 sports that I play big time. When I first started vaping, I just turned 15 years old, so I've been doing it for about a year now. All my teammates do it. It's just pretty normal for everybody to do it.
People that I know that do it, they're like good students, like straight A's. It's a normal thing to do. I was 13 the first time I vaped.
People at my high school, they would vape on the bus just because it's like so easy to hide. It's just like a little like black pen. I could just vape at home like my parents don't.
When I'm riding my bike, like far distances, it makes me feel like I'm riding away. And the reason I vape is to basically get away and get my mind off of things. I was 13 years old when I vaped for the first time. I started buying $5 vaporizers, and from there, I moved on to bigger ones.
Most of my friends that vape, they use nicotine. A lot of nicotine, actually. Because you can put as much nicotine into it as you want. The concentrates can go way past just cigarettes.
There's too many flavors to count. There are endless amounts that you can get.
There's cotton candy, bubblegum, peppermint.
Some that taste like pancakes, coffee flavor.
I heard one was unicorn puke. It sounds like cartoon flavors or something.
It makes them seem a little bit more kid-friendly, so people are, okay with doing it.
Some of my friends, they're sponsored by vape companies. They just get sent stuff for free, because then they make YouTube videos of all the tricks that they're doing, and they're like, oh, this is the juice I'm using, this is the mod I'm using.
A lot of people post them on their Snapchat stories or on Instagram of them vaping. They tend to be more popular.
You know, I can look up vape and a whole bunch of videos will come up and I can see what kind of cool tricks they're doing, learn what the name is, and I can go look it up on YouTube about how to do it.
It's the whole culture. It's kind of a big deal for a lot of people that I know.
Sometimes I do feel pressured into vaping. With all this social media nowadays, it has a really big effect on what people just think about you.
If you don't vape, you're looked at as outsider, so everybody does it.
Oh, I just had to stop it for a sec there.
That line.
Yeah, that 1 second, hold on. Yeah, that line is unbelievable. Sorry, everyone. I just gonna get my mixers happening here. We're gonna play the last 2 minutes of this, or last minute of this piece, but just stop for a sec there and let's just bask in that anti-vaping
Exactly.
comment.
You don't want to tell a child, you don't, and they're clearly these kids are not writing their own lines, because what kid knows how much nicotine's in a cigarette?
Oh, I know. Totally. Okay, so here, let's get back to it.
Vape, you're looked at as outsider, so everybody does it.
I think people that you would never expect would definitely be vapers. It's becoming like more and more popular.
Vaping is considered cool in my group of friends. It might just be the fact that you're doing something you know you shouldn't be doing.
There's no worry that a parent's gonna find us vaping on social media. We've gotten really good at hiding it from our parents.
I know I'm underage, but it's just something that I do. I won't let it affect my future.
Oh, anyhow. Okay, so clearly that was a lot of fun there with my switching, but wow, what a piece that is.
Yeah, and so, you mentioned
Shaw
the
Blue Curve
study.
TV. Stop searching, start watching.
You mean start.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that if it's almost as if I'm writing my study for some rich vapor person who has millions of dollars who wants to do an anti-vaping ad. I'm writing it towards the psychologists, the researchers who've done this research already on other types of public health messaging, who know exactly what not to do if you're trying to talk to adolescents and to convince them to do something that's better for them or healthier, or to avoid something that might be riskier. And so weirdly, that commercial did one thing very right, which is instead of having doctors or teachers or parents talk to the kids, they had teens, real California teens. And that's exactly the way that you would get a teenager to listen to you, because they would think authority and just immediately shut it out. But then you have the teenagers saying all of these messages like, all of my friends are vaping. They're cooler. They get paid by vape companies. If you don't vape, you're looked at as an outsider. It's almost like the people at the California Public Health Department took the playbook that I have and just went exactly in the opposite direction on almost everything, except for have somebody other than an authority give this message to teenagers.
So isn't this the crux of the issue here? Because they've got the best history and knowledge and research and understanding of messaging to kids about getting them to not do things like don't smoke and this and that, right? So if they are so well prepared and they produce a spot like that, a campaign like that, how could it not be done? Is it sloppy or is it on purpose?
I think it's more, I'm an optimist. Even with the worst of the worst, I like to believe that there's good intentions behind whatever they're doing. So I have to believe that this is the California Department of Health. Starting in 2015, they were spending $75 million, and that was for a 5-year period. And I know they got more money during that period of time. I think they've spent at least about $100 million in the last 5 years on anti-vaping ads just in California. They gave most of that, I believe, to media companies to make these commercials. So I don't know how much they were directing these media companies on what the messaging should look like or how they should be doing it. I know the FDA did some of this research themselves, and they said, we're going to laser focus, because they knew that their anti-vaping messaging, if heard by adult smokers, would put them off of vaping. And they said this in their research, so we have to make sure we only target adolescents. And without even mentioning the fact that some of those adolescents might grow up to be smokers and still have this anti-vaping message in the back of their head and then never switch. But with California, I think it's most likely, from my optimistic point of view, most likely that they just didn't bother with the research, or they didn't bother to direct the media company on what not to do. And so what we have is, and the worst isn't even that advertisement, because most teenagers will see that, clock it immediately as an ad from the health department and ignore it. The worst is when you have news media pick up on it, because that's another non-authority source that, we read the headline and we say, well, it's not Bloomberg, it's not Gottlieb at the FDA or the Surgeon General. It's just some news reporter who's presumably done some research, and they've come to this conclusion. And I see the headline, and I'm not going to read the entire story, and I'm not going to do any more research other than read the headline. And then I'm going to walk away with this in the back of my head, and I'm going to hear it from other people, and then I'm going to see the ad from the Department of Health, and it's just going to get stuck in there, and I'm going to believe it eventually because I don't have time to do counter research.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you about that. I do think some of it's on purpose, but yeah, you're right. How do you get to the full purposeful aspect of it? So, one of the things is that every person in media will tell you, whether you are creating a television spot or whether you're creating a news piece, whether you're creating, really any piece of media, is the last things that are said, the last messages communicated, the very last messages communicated in the piece are the ones that will be remembered. And the ones in this piece were all, it's cool, everyone's doing it, and if you don't do it, you're going to be ostracized.
I think where the blame, where I could say there's some tinfoil hat on moment, I think the California Department of Health, when they were making that ad, it wasn't actually meant to target teenagers. It wasn't meant for kids. It was meant for their parents. It was meant for their parents. It was meant for lawmakers, regulators. It was meant to say, and that's what I think a lot of the messaging has actually been targeted, not at kids, it's been targeted at adults to convince them of the existence of this epidemic. Because if there are kids, if you're targeting your message at kids, the last thing you want to say is it's an epidemic, meaning all of your friends are doing it, because that just convinces them to try, so that they should probably be doing it as well if they want to fit in. But if you're trying to convince adults that this is something they should worry about, contact their lawmakers about, spend money on if you're a regulator, then that it's an epidemic is exactly what a health organization that's trying to plump up its budget for a health crisis, that's exactly what the message you want to communicate. So I think that's the conspiracy, or that's the ill intent, is that they never meant, I don't think they cared if teens saw it, because they're like, oh, well, it still has a good message that they shouldn't vape. But the real intent behind it was adults.
Right. And then, of course, we've got the famous, not to contradict the great Michelle Minton here, but we do have FDA's real cost campaign, which was titled Epidemic, and which starts
their first
with
video. Yeah.
And yeah, it starts with the voiceover that says an epidemic is spreading. And let's avail ourselves of it. Now, let me just try to see if I can do this much smoother this time here. All right, there we go.
There's an epidemic spreading. Scientists say it can change your brain. It can release dangerous chemicals like formaldehyde into your bloodstream. It can expose your lungs to acrolein, which can cause irreversible damage. It's not a parasite, not a virus, not an infection. It's vaping.
Now, fun, isn't it?
Well, see, now that one was actually a little bit better than and what's interesting about that ad is
I just need to keep them entertained.
It came out the same week that Scott Gottlieb made his announcement that there was an epidemic, which says to anybody with sense that they had been building this campaign around the idea of an epidemic for much longer than the data, right? Much longer than when they just got the data. It would take many months at least to make an ad like that. But either way, the message, what that was communicating, with visually anyway, was that, they were showing kids vaping, which is not good, because you're just demonstrating other kids your age vaping is not a great idea if you're trying to convince them to not do it. But the message they're trying to communicate is that it takes over your brain, that it takes away your independence and your autonomy, which that is not a bad message to tell kids if you're trying to get them to avoid an addictive substance, to be like, well, this will take away your free will. It's not just you being an adult, it takes away your ability to have your own choices and to be autonomous. And that's something kids, at least on the surface, want to have. They want to say, I'm an independent person.
Yeah, they want to, but exactly. Okay, so
But they're also susceptible to groupthink and to trying to be part of the crowd, the in crowd.
yeah, so far these ads, so here, let me just pop us back over here for a sec to the computer, and this is the document that I'm using. It's for the ads here. This was a part of the opposition research that I did last year in November of 2018, November of 2018, as we were putting the Whole Truth campaign together, which we're executing right now with our short snippet pieces that are going out. But we were looking to be putting 30-second ads on the air in the U.S. nationally on national cable. And so as a part of that, I did an opponent's execution overview. And then, of course, I wanted to talk a little bit about this in the weeds, because you had mentioned in your report about the $625 million 5-year ad spend that FDA awarded actually in the fall, right? In the fall of 2018 when the epidemic had started. And so that was continuing work for FCB New York, and that's Foot, Cone, and Belding. For those that don't know, they've got nearly 9,000 employees. They're headquartered in New York and Chicago, and they're part of IPG, the Interpublic Group, which is a massive, massive worldwide conglomerate for advertising, media marketing. So it's all connected. The news media and public relations component of FCB is working with the creative side. And so, I mean, that's why it's $600 and something million. And so there's no way anybody can compete with that. And that's just FDA. That's just the Real Cost campaign. Yeah. That's not everything else. And then of course, there's a lot of campaigns that have been done. Some I didn't highlight, but these were kind of the real key ones, all the way even from Alaska's Quit Line piece. Let's watch this. That's 30 seconds.
From your first puff, you feel in control. But with each drag, the nicotine takes over, and the puppet strings pull tighter and tighter. Don't let corporate big tobacco keep stringing you along. E-cigarettes, same nicotine, new packaging, same addiction. Tobacco controls.
So
from your first
again, who's that ad for? Like, do teens care much about, big corporate, big tobacco?
No. No, and it's one of the examples I saw in the research I was looking at when they were talking about just general public health campaigning, for example, anti-littering campaigns or public safety campaigns. If someone is walking in the woods and they're just following a trail, they're just going to keep going, whatever, la la la. But if they see a sign that says, don't enter here, danger here, there's going to be a portion of the people who pass by that sign and just go, I wonder what that is. And then they're going to go over there. They would have never gone in that direction on the trail had they not seen that sign. And I think a lot of times that's what's happening with the e-cigarette, the anti-vaping, the youth vaping advertisements, is they're telling kids this is a thing they should avoid, this danger here, don't do this. And most of them would have just ignored it. Some of them might not actually. I mean, I know we've heard a million stories about high schools just filled with kids vaping all over the place. So kids are seeing it all the time. But there is a large portion of teenagers and adolescents who maybe see it and don't think about it, don't care about it. But the more they hear about it, the more they're thinking, maybe I should take a look at that. And that's the curiosity angle that the CDC picked up. And I really hope that they ask that question in the next year's survey, because I would love to see if that starts to correlate with the number of youth vaping.
I agree, and that's worth being on the list of things that you want to know about. And let's jump back to, that was CDC. 1 second. I do apologize there. It's this one right here. So self-fulfilling epidemic, void or risk backfire. The second one is making a product behavior seem more attractive. I know you've already talked about that to some extent, but for the sake of television, I'm going to get you to...
Well, not exactly. No, this is a little bit different. It doesn't sound different, I know, but so when adults are doing advertisements aimed at children or adolescents to stop them from doing a thing, they're saying, there was one ad, I think it was FDA that produced it, where it showed happy group of teenagers at a bowling alley, and one of the teenagers goes into this dark alleyway, and there's ominous music, and it's nighttime, and it looks like a horror movie, a scene from a horror film, and she's in the alleyway vaping away from her friends. And the adults, the old people who made this ad, think that what they're showing is an unattractive scenario, but they don't understand how much teenagers are attracted to risk and danger, and how much they love horror films and would love to be the star, to be like one of their celebrities in a horror film. And they don't understand that what they are actually doing is making it more attractive. That if they make something look dangerous, that can in and of itself make a thing look more attractive to an adolescent, or to a specific subclass of adolescents who are interested in risk, which is what you see with kids who are going to vape, who are going to smoke, who are going to try drugs. Doesn't mean they're all going to end up being smokers, drug addicts, or vapors, but there's a certain group of adolescents who are more inclined towards taking risks. And if you then just have flashing neon signs saying the risk is over here, they're going to go that direction. And that's what we're seeing. Monitoring the Future is another very popular, very big annual survey of youth substance use. And what they found was that with marijuana use among the youth, it didn't change. Between 2018 and 2019, it didn't really change, lifetime or past month use. But the number of youth who reported using marijuana through vaping skyrocketed at the same time as youth vaping overall was increasing. And so what that says is it might not just be the nicotine e-cigarettes or the e-cigarette companies advertising to kids that's making them interested in vaping as a mode of substance use. Because the parlance among adults and health departments and everybody, the news is just vaping when they're talking about nicotine e-cigarettes. Teenagers have gotten the message about vaping, and in some ways, and I'll be vilified for saying this, if they were going to use something, if they're going to use something that could be smoked through a combustible method, traditionally or usually vaping would be the healthier option. Unfortunately, when they go to the black market, when they're using bootleg products that have other substances in them, that is not safe. But if you had a free market with legal access to things, and a young person had it in their head for whatever reason that they were going to pick up a new substance, they were going to become a substance user, it would be better if they used it through vaping, through non-combustible form, than through combustible, through cigarettes or smoking pot. Fortunately, a lot of kids now are starting to get the message that vaping is so dangerous. If the ones who want to be healthier think it's safer to smoke pot than it is to vape pot, which is, after this summer with the outbreak, that, you could see where maybe some people would think that's a good thing, but it's still overall, the outbreak was one very small, contained contamination of black market products. Overall, vaping marijuana or consuming it through edibles would be far safer than doing it through combustibles, rolled up, smoking a joint.
Yeah, if you're eating it, make sure you're not standing on an upright position.
Yeah, well, make sure you follow directions or read Google. Don't be like those reporters who say, I went to Colorado and I tried marijuana and then it didn't do anything, so I just kept eating it, and then I drank wine and then I had a real bad trip. Marijuana is dangerous. Still, make sure you have only a small amount, from what I understand.
Well, they say your first time using it anyhow, you don't really understand the effect, as the Canadian government calls it. They don't call it the high because we're legal up here, right? And so they call it the effect.
Mm-hmm. It's actually very smart, because if they said high, that would constitute advertising potentially.
Yeah, I guess so. It would, wouldn't it? Well, but then again, though, they are the ones selling it, so you would think that they'd want to maybe push a little bit more. Last one on our self-fulfilling epidemic: avoid this or risk backfire, public health, and that is portraying the behavior as common or normal. Do tell, Michelle.
Yeah, and that's the use of the word epidemic. That means it's normal. First of all, an epidemic does not describe a behavior. Even by the CDC standards, the CDC definition is a increase, usually sudden, of a cases of disease. Use of an e-cigarette is not a disease, it's a behavior. So to call it an epidemic, to call a behavior an epidemic, is already a little bit skewed. But then to say that this behavior is epidemic, in normal conversational English, that means there's a large number of people doing it. So you start looking around yourself and saying, well, is everybody doing this? Should I be doing this? And normalizing, that's also with these advertisements showing the devices, showing the product, showing the different flavors, and showing adolescents using the products, how to use them. You know, the one ad from California showed how to get away with it, how to hide it, even how to hide it from your parents. That normalizes the behavior. So kids, because if you think about heroin use, right? Most of us just know it maybe from a movie. Maybe we saw one movie and it was always portrayed horribly. But if you start seeing just normal looking people in your everyday life or on television, just people who just have a normal life and maybe they're cool and they have a lot of friends just using heroin, and you see how they do it, maybe you might think, maybe I could give that a try. And that's what we're doing right now with vaping, aimed directly at teenagers, supposedly, is showing them exactly how it works and how all of their friends are doing it. So that normalizes the behavior, and it makes the hurdle to trying it takes away the taboo, honestly, of it, where taboo is a pretty big hurdle, especially for adolescents who don't want to deviate too far from what everybody else is doing. Once you lower that hurdle, it makes it much easier for teenagers to give it a try. And that's the, you know, there is no epidemic of youth vaping. The numbers of kids who use e-cigarettes regularly is extremely low. The number of adolescents who use e-cigarettes who never used tobacco at all, who never smoked, is, you know, in 2018 it was under 4%. That's a very small percentage of high school and middle school combined. But as you normalize it, you know, you have kids trying it, and that's what gets captured by these once, you know, in the last month, did you ever? That's what gets captured when we say almost 30% of students say they used e-cigarettes. Doesn't mean they're using it all the time. The vast majority, I think over 70, 80%, used e-cigarettes less than 5 days in the month, 5 or fewer days in that month. So that's a very low percentage.
You know, there's something about that I've yet to actually talk about on the show. We've scraped up against it a couple of times. So let me just see here if I can do it very easily. So it's the 30-day measure. That's the issue. So it's 30-day past use. And so since we've been doing coverage on vaping, that has been every research we've talked to, certainly early on, you know, there was a lot of discussion about that being such a terrible measure. And it's really the one that they want to highlight because it's the one that's larger. It's the numbers that larger, and it's credible to the extent that a kid did report that they did use it in the last 30 days. And so we're going to record that, and that's the number we're using. And it is indeed that number that they scare the public with and they do all their fear mongering with. However, in the master settlement agreement with the big tobacco companies and the formula in which the tobacco companies pay the states based on how many teens stopped smoking compared to how many teens stayed smoking or started smoking, this and that, right? So they look at that, and the tobacco companies have to pay the states extra money every year based on whether or not the tobacco companies were able to lower the teen smoking rate. And so they base that number on 7 days. So it's a bit crooked, right? Yeah. Like the entire real number that they use is a 7-day number. That's the number that's legally used. That's the number that, you know, fines and money is paid on. That's the real number. But instead of past use in 7 days, they use for the public past use in 30.
Yeah, current use is what it's usually defined as. So current use being, have you used it all in the last 7 days, for example? And if you look at the numbers of high school students who are current users of cigarettes, it's very, very low. Or even past month cigarette users, it's very, very low, which is more interesting to me than someone saying I used an e-cigarette once a month or even 5 times in the last month does not reveal a pattern of dependence yet. It could, but it doesn't necessarily. However, someone say I used 0 cigarettes in the last month is a very clear indication that they are not dependent on cigarettes. They're not dependent on nicotine in that form, because otherwise they would have to use at least once it's just not dependence if you can go a full month without having any nicotine from a cigarette. So that to me is, when you look at those numbers and you compare them together, it's much more interesting, because the number of students of high school and middle school students who are not dependent on smoking anymore is so huge, and the number of students who are probably not dependent, maybe dependent on e-cigarettes is so small. It's extraordinary that we're focusing on, a friend passed a joint to me at a party. I'm a pot user. And that's the news story that would go out if we said, if anybody cared about the youth marijuana use numbers, but nobody does anymore because it's all about e-cigarettes. But if they care, they say, 30% of youth are binge drinking. They're current binge drinkers because they had one episode of binge drinking in the last month. And that's a true percentage right now. Of high school students, it's almost 30% report binge drinking once at least in the last month, which is no news headlines about that. No talks about banning flavored alcohol, which I'm not suggesting. I am not suggesting we ban marijuana or flavored alcohol, but it's very fascinating that we're so focused on this one aspect of youth health and not the totality of it.
Well, I agree. And it's definitely problematic. So we're going to be ramping up shortly. I've got a few more questions. What I want to make sure that I do and take a moment here is just to ask everybody to take a look at our gear, because there's a lot more new stuff. There's at least 2 or 3 credit card racks filled of gear here, but we've got fantastic gear now finally, which is really important for us for our online. Now, what that means though is it doesn't mean that there's not going to be still a few technical errors, but when there are, you can count on them being operator error, as opposed to them coming from software with like Wirecast. Again, do not buy Wirecast. They're a major company owned by Telestream. They are a rotten piece of software, and the support there is brutal. But on that note, I do want to recommend everybody go to support.regulatorwatch.com, which is our support website, and help us get those credit cards down. Actually, we spent pretty much everything we've brought in since the lung crisis started in the fall, went right back into gear, guys. So if you do get a chance, please go to support.regulatorwatch.com, check out who supports, and hopefully we'll be adding some new people. Of course, Demand Vape, John Glauser, great guy and great company. And of course, their sister company, Juno, and Divine Labs, Stealth, and Flavor Art, all up in Canada. And of course, our monthly rock stars. We've got space for more. And one-time heroes, throw those American dollars to us. We love American dollars, and they really make a big difference for us. A lot of our gear, all of our gear was bought in American dollars. And so I'd use Canadian dollars first. So anyhow, that being said, guys, if you can, support.regulatorwatch.com, and it'd be most appreciated. Michelle, I'm starting to do this with my reoccurring guests. Make a pitch for why RegWatch is important.
Oh, I mean, I'm a donor, not to get you accused of being a shill for having me on, but I've definitely supported RegWatch. It's the news. There are a few reporters out there who can report on any science issue, honestly, objectively. In the vaping space, it seems to be an even smaller number. So people like you, a few other outlets, there are a few reporters who really try hard to understand all of the facets of the conversation, are extremely important when everyone else in the world is being hit over the head by headlines from the New York Times about how evil Juul is for making all these kids, forcing e-cigarettes into their mouths and making them do it every single day until they're addicted. So it's extremely valuable to have a voice.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you for your support. That is so fantastic. And it really is excellent. So, all right. So as we start to look to wrapping up here, I wanted to ask you this because it seems to be all over what we're talking about today. And that is, and let me just see if I can put this back up as easy as possible here, which I think I can. Yes. So I was curious about them, was 55.3%. And then, the thing is, it's the next stat that gets me even more. And that is this one. Friend or family member used them. And because that used to be always the top one. So let's just dissect that for a minute, because what we're talking about here is the fact is that I've always felt the attack on vaping, and why now? Like, why at this critical time that it really unleashed? And it's a planned thing. It was rolled out in January of 2018. We already started seeing like the local San Diego, stories that are happening in local news here in San Diego. Progressive hell there, San Francisco, percolating all over the place. It was already a huge fad nationally. Well, was it? Yeah. Or is it just, the story that got, pumped there in San Diego? within 3 months, I mean, I had Demi on and we were already doing an orchestrated attack. It was moving national in 3 months. And that was all driven by local news media, and then the national media grabbed it. And you have to know that these media companies that, you know, the PR companies that are working with FDA and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and Truth Initiative, and as you outlined so brilliantly in Fear Profiteers, they're talking, they're coordinating, they're working together. So why wouldn't they be working together on the actual ad campaigns and the PR strategy of the news stories to pump up the epidemic? So in this conversation, we're talking about how they may be using some tools or not using some tools specifically that, you know, are leading to kids, you know, trying the products. One of the things, and I believe all that, I think you've done a great job there, and I can't wait for the report to come out and so people can see it and read it themselves. For me, the issue is that, you know, if your uncle is smoking, if your friends are smoking, if your dad is smoking, your mom is smoking, you're going to be a smoker, right? Like the likelihood that you're going to be a smoker is high, and they know that, right? I mean, that's like bread and butter tobacco control. So vaping in 2016 and 2017, right, really started becoming normalized. It was really starting to become, the virtues of vaping were starting to fully crack through. Canada made it legal, right? All of that kind of stuff. And so it just felt to me that there was this panic within public health to kill this, to kill that virtue, which means to kill the parents doing it, to kill all of that internal stuff that happens that normalizes it. Not normalized because your peers are doing it at high school, the normalization that happens with family.
I think it's a little bit of that. It's also, you know, those numbers. So what they're asking about is why, you know, they're asking the entire set of students who responded, yes, I used a vape at least once in the last month. Why did you use it? The response of a friend or family member used it may just simply be revealing of access, where you had access to this thing. My parent doesn't smoke. You know, my friends don't smoke, but they were passing a vape around, or I stole my uncle's vape for a second and tried it. And that's why, you know, that's how I used it, and why I said I used an e-cigarette at least once in the last month. And the other thing is, yes, so a child is most likely, if they're going to use the substance, they are most likely to use the substance that their parents use because they're seeing it. Again, it's that normalization, that's familiarization, getting used to it, understanding how to use it, where to get it, etc. So if you see a parent do all of those habits and have all of those behaviors around it, you're more likely to do it. So honestly, if a kid is going to do something, if they're going to use nicotine in some form, this or another non-combustible form would be the better way to go about it. I don't know if there's, you know, any active saying, well, we're just going to sacrifice the adults. It does seem that way. It seems that public health, you know, the mainstream public health has given up on smokers. They don't seem to care about the however many hundreds of thousands of people die or become sick every year because of smoking. They're only focused on kids right now while they're kids. When they grow up to be adults, they don't care. If they're going to be smokers, they just want them to stop. And if they don't stop, they don't really care if they live or die or get out of San Francisco. But you know, you mentioned panic and this instinct to kill e-cigarettes. I don't think that's what it was, actually. I think what it was blood in the water and spotting a perfect opportunity. And one of the things I get into in my paper is how much spending increased among health departments when they started fluffing up this idea of an e-cigarette epidemic. And you saw the one graph that I absolutely love from the California Public Health Department about how much California was spending per capita on tobacco control. It immediately skyrocketed, just, you know, almost a 90-degree angle from very small amounts to a huge amount of dollars per person when the California Department of Health started putting out all of these ads about youth e-cigarette use. And then Governor Gavin Newsom signed a special order giving them even more money the next year because of how horrible the epidemic was. And whenever you see CDC testify in front of Congress, you'll notice a lot of people talking about how much more their budget needs to be increased to deal with this giant problem. The FDA is doing the same thing, saying, well, we need the e-cigarette industry cause this problem. We need to give them user fees so that we can pay to deal with the problem. It's just a giant opportunity for everybody. I'm sure there's a small percentage of people who would love to see e-cigarettes and tobacco entirely just disappear. But most people recognize that were that to happen, their jobs would also disappear. Their raison d'etre, their reason for existing, would also disappear. So whether or not it's conscious or just inherent in their personalities, they need tobacco in some form. And we saw this with Campaign for Tobacco Free Kids. Before the advent of e-cigarettes, before they really started to become popular, they were targeting an anti-flavor campaign at lozenges. How many kids really were using nicotine lozenges? I don't think we'll ever really know that, but they had a whole campaign centered around this idea of banning flavored lozenges. And that's completely gone. You would never see them talk about that anymore because e-cigarettes came around and they were much flashier and cooler and much more, other people were starting to talk about it even before talking about planning this stuff out. Before the outbreak, the epidemic of, e-cigarette, vaping, lung injuries from illicit THC, the FDA was putting out the call for people to tell them about having seizures on if they've been using e-cigarettes and had seizures.
That's right. They had that was like for about 6 or 7 weeks. It was all about the seizures.
Tons of news stories. Tons of news stories. The FDA said, "Here's who you contact. Tell us your stories. We don't care if you have a seizure disorder. If you had a seizure and you use e-cigarettes, tell us about it." And then the outbreak occurred. Nothing. Crickets on seizures. We don't care because they were, I think, looking for something to prop up. In the lead up to the pre-market tobacco application process, they were looking for some evidence, something to build up the anti-vaping sentiment. And then they just had this giant gift dropped into their laps, which, people like the reporters at Leafly had been telling them was going to happen for years. So they maybe could have guessed it would happen sometime around now, or it was going to happen eventually. But how conscious it is, how conscientious and collaborative it is. They're definitely all collaborating. I've seen that from the FOIA requests. They all talk to each other. They literally have multi-state collaboratives on these issues to hash out policy, talking points, etc. One of the results from the Michigan FOIA, you have a director at the health department actually telling someone in the governor's office to ask Bloomberg, and I only know one Bloomberg, so I'm assuming it's the one I'm thinking of, to ask Bloomberg to fund their statewide anti-vaping campaign. So there's collaboration and planning, and not a lot of people, except for I think you, me, all the people who are watching right now, who are going to watch later, we all get it. But there's a lot of people out there, your mom, my mom, who might be watching right now. So hi, Mom, if you're watching, might not have, like I said, had the time or the interest to go and look beyond the headlines that are being sold to them from people like Bloomberg or the CDC.
Right. Well, and I agree with everything you just said. And just to reinforce an important point you made, and it's one that we made here at RegWatch last fall strongly, which is that they needed to, when I say, they took away the virtues of vaping, that kind of thing, that sounds nice, some good alliteration there and so forth. But let's really talk about what's happening here. They were searching for something to, basically smear vaping with, because they knew that once the PMTA rolls around, with that is the industry killer, that would be government coming in and shutting down 11,000 businesses, throwing 150,000 people out of work. They needed a pretext for that. And if they could have held on, I think, if they could have held on a couple more months longer with some of the deaths, they would have been just as happy to do so, right? But, it happened too soon. And that's why they had to jump and try to force the president to take action. That's why and all the states' action and everything else, because they're desperate, but now they've done the damage. So PMTA, who knows how that's going to shake out. But no matter what, if it does turn into a complete total industry killer, the blow against government, the blowback against government is going to be much diminished because of all of this, smear.
No, yeah. I mean, so the CDC held out as long as they could, I think, in admitting, and from the FOIA documents that I've seen, the states were asking them why they're not, even within Michigan, for example, you had someone at the marijuana, the Department of Regulation for Marijuana, asking the health department why they're being so silent on the marijuana issue in the outbreak. The CDC held on absolutely the longest amount they could without running into a potential congressional hearing asking why they weren't telling the public. Very important information. I still think that hearing should occur. I think those investigations should occur, but I think CDC walked it right to the edge of the cliff where it was super obvious to everybody that they were lying or omitting and withholding information. No, yes, this is definitely planned, orchestrated to have the maximum impact. Like you said, I think they probably would have preferred it to happen just slightly later, but it was enough that even very, very intelligent people, scientists, researchers, the people who are going to be on the committees deciding whether individual companies are granted their PMTAs, have been inundated with these news stories for months now, for more than the outbreak, longer than the outbreak. They've been hearing it. They're going to have, oh, there's metals leaching in from the devices, or formaldehyde, if they can pronounce it, in the vape. So I don't know. I want to see more information, and that will definitely tint the way that the PMTA process goes. And we're already starting to see. We've just started to hear that the FDA is telling members of Congress that none of the vapor companies are asking for help with their PMTA process, which I'm not a vapor company, so I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that that's not true, which to me says that the FDA is starting already to lay the groundwork for after the process, after the deadline passes, when companies say, we needed help and you didn't give it to us. They could say, you didn't ask. Sorry, you're off the market. So they are pretty calculating, it seems to me, about understanding the way the news cycle works, the way people absorb information, how little they absorb, how they just absorb headlines, and what makes them willing or not to fight the public, right? There was enough of a groundswell. We just saw it with Stanton Glance's paper that got retracted, is ridiculous study, quote unquote study, that supposedly showed e-cigarettes caused heart attacks. However, when other physicians and other researchers who had access to the same data looked at it, they said, oh, a good portion of the people who had heart attacks had them before they ever started vaping. So this is a BS study. And they talked to the journal, and the journal didn't retract. And then it got enough news stories and enough attention that I think they were forced to retract the study. They knew what was wrong with the study. It just took them this long because there was enough public pressure. And that's what lawmakers do, and that's what people in health departments do, is they do whatever they can get away with until they get caught. And the catching is usually by us, by the people watching your show, by news media, by asking questions about what they're doing. The CDC was getting enough questions about the THC angle that they had to admit that it had something to do with it. And so if you taint public opinion enough about e-cigarettes, people are going to be much less likely to fight it. And we saw the same thing with smokers. Smokers themselves are almost none of them will fight back when someone talks about taxing their product to death. Basically, in New York, a product that is no longer accessible legally for most people, where you have to buy it on the black market, if a Mayor Bloomberg said, I'm going to raise the tax to $20, very few smokers would even say anything about it because they've been so beaten down and there's no one to defend them. They just won't say anything. So then they get away with it. They just roll forward. There's no opposition. Let's do it. So that is what I think you're right with the planning up ahead of PMTA, when the FDA is going to come out and basically say 2 companies get PMTAs, only tobacco flavored. We're done. And the public has been so tainted against e-cigarettes, no one's really going to be up in arms about the fact that the FDA is preventing a life-saving technology from getting into the hands of consumers.
How likely do you think that that's going to be what happens?
I really can't predict on that one because it depends on the public. I think I'm more optimistic now than I was 3 months ago because there have been a couple more good news stories. The news media has finally picked up on the THC aspect, and I think they were a little bit upset because journalists tend to believe the CDC. They rely on the CDC to give them the information, and they oftentimes don't have the time or the will to look beyond what the CDC is telling them. And because I know those journalists were hearing from people saying it's THC, it's THC, it's THC, it's black market, and they were towing the CDC line. When the CDC finally turned around and said, yeah, I guess it's illicit black market THC, I think some of those reporters were a little bit shaken and woken up to the fact that maybe that isn't trustworthy information all of the time. At least that's what I hope. And I think the public is also becoming more aware of that as well. So if that sentiment starts to grow, with the Stanton Glantz paper being retracted, this paper that was so huge and important in the buildup to the anti-vaping sentiment among the public. There were so many news headlines about the fact that e-cigarettes are no better for your heart than smoking. I saw 100 headlines that were exactly that. If there are a lot of headlines saying this very important study that we all use to base our opinions on e-cigarettes has been retracted, has problems, if we can build that up, then the public might become more skeptical and might start to look at e-cigarettes the way they do in England or New Zealand or other places, or the way we look at life-saving drugs, for example. There's a good amount of pressure on the FDA to approve life-saving drugs, drugs for orphan diseases, that kind of thing. If we can get people to start looking at e-cigarettes that way again, as it was in the beginning when e-cigarettes first started to gain in popularity, then I think the FDA will not be able to get away with only approving a few of them. They will have to approve more.
Well, and that's definitely what everybody is hoping for. Well, I'll get some industry people on. I won't make you have to be the fortune teller here for the industry, but Michelle, look, I want to thank you so much for not just coming on the show, but everything you do, because you're a researcher, but you're also an advocate, I guess, without putting the advocate label on you. It's just you're somebody who cares a whole awful lot about vaping.
I care more than anything about people being able to take their own health into their hands. I'm a nutritionist by trade. And one of the things that really gets me just riled up every time is when we talk about the nutritional guidelines, except for the fact that the nutritional guidelines really don't mean much in America. They don't do much here. People can just ignore them. But they're so wrong. And all of the science behind them is political and wrong in a lot of ways. And they're useless and dangerous to certain groups of people who have, for example, eating disorders. So that gets me upset. And I look at cannabis and I think of all the people who have been put in jail, their lives ruined, completely ruined, because they just wanted to smoke a joint like I would like to have a beer after work, or they wanted to sell it because they were low income and this was the best way for them to make money. And then I look at vaping and I see a huge portion of the population, and not just in America, when I look at the smoking rates in India, or I look at indigenous people in Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, and I see the perfect solution. It doesn't cost the government any money. All they have to do is let people use this product. And then I see all the science being twisted. That drives me bananas. When I see science being miscommunicated or being actively twisted for a political purpose, that sets me off like nothing else, because I can read the science, so I can pretty much see when somebody is lying or omitting or twisting. And I understand, because I wasn't always knowledgeable about science, I understand what it's like to read and I still read the paper about things I'm not knowledgeable about, and I'm like, it sounds right. Flip the page. That drives me insane, because it's a violation of trust from these people that they're supposed to have earned our trust in some way. And I have a lot of respect for the CDC for what they've done with infectious diseases. Those people who are dealing with the coronavirus, for example, who've dealt with bird flu, avian flu, etc., they're heroes. But they're not everybody at the CDC. And those people are actually losing money because the people who are in the tobacco control division are taking it from them to deal with a non-issue. And so that kind of stuff just makes me infuriated. And I have so many friends who were smokers whose lives have been saved for sure through e-cigarettes. It should be their right as an adult person, even if they weren't a smoker. And this is where I'm really going off. Even if you're just an adult, let's say you are a Mormon who decides not to be a Mormon anymore, and you say, I want to drink alcohol or drink coffee. I don't even know if Mormons aren't supposed to drink coffee anymore, but you're an adult. That should be your choice to do that. If you're an adult and you understand what nicotine is and you decide you want to try it, that should be your right. It shouldn't be anybody's right to tell you not to, and definitely not to force you to do it in the most dangerous way possible, which is an illegal product, an illegal combustible product.
Absolutely. Well, so look, cigarettes are legal. That means nicotine is legal. And so, I'd like to support a nicotine habit that's not going to kill me. That's, and I should have that right.
Yeah, I'd love to have alcohol that wasn't poisoned by the government like they did during Prohibition. I'm an adult. I want to have alcohol. I don't want it to be poisoned. And the government says, well, this is bad for you. So you have one choice. Don't drink alcohol or drink this poisoned alcohol.
Well,
it's insane.
On that note, I think we'll leave it at that right there. Thank you so much, Michelle, for coming back on RegWatch. I want you to just hang on there for 1 second. And before we go, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today on this edition of RegWatch. And before you head off, please head over to support.regulatorwatch.com. That's support.regulatorwatch.com. And consider making a financial contribution to our vaping coverage. It's easy. Just dig into your wallet and find a few dollars and toss them our way. You'll be happy you did it, and so will we. And while online, don't forget to like us on Facebook and please follow us on Twitter. For regulatorwatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.